I'm not a hero. There were some in the hunt for Escobar. A lot, actually. But it's tough to see them through all the blood. To kill a monster, sometimes you have to get in bed with other monsters. If that surprises you, pick up a history book. It's what we do. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, until he becomes my enemy again. When that happens, God help them. The day Pablo went down, the Cali cartel became public enemy #1. And the fact that they helped us bring him down didn't mean shit. While the whole world was focused on Escobar, Cali's operations had grown exponentially, differing from their rival in every possible way. Where Pablo sought the love and protection of the masses of Medellin, these guys rubbed shoulders with Colombia's elite and called themselves the Gentlemen of Cali. And whereas Escobar craved the spotlight, these guys stayed in the shadows, perfecting the game, building complex smuggling and distribution networks through Mexico, Europe, and the Far East, without leaving so much as a fingerprint. Even the people working for them didn't know it was Cali Coke they were moving. It was fucking Cocaine Incorporated, and they ran it like a Fortune 500 company. So without further ado, meet the management team of the Cali cartel. Patrolera, head of distribution and security. He led a team of young psychopaths who would do anything he asked. Chepe Santa Cruz Londoño grew up with the Rodriguez brothers. He was in charge of U.S. operations and responsible for Cali's crown jewel, New York City. He actually lived there, under an assumed name, of course. Cartel's #2 was operations chief Miguel Rodriguez. Miguel watched over all the money coming in and what bribes they were paying out. And last but not least, cartel CEO, the man with the plan, Gilberto Rodriguez. They called him the chess player because he was always one move ahead. They were the pinnacle of trafficking evolution, apex drug dealers, and being #2 allowed them to quietly grow into the biggest cocaine cartel in history. Except now that was over. Now that the guy that occupied our attention was gone, they were #1 with a fucking bullet. And there was no chess move that would get them out of it, but I was looking forward to seeing them try. Just because we've been focused on Escobar the past few years didn't mean we were completely ignoring the Cali Godfathers. We had agents on them the whole time. Good agents. And recently, they'd gotten lucky. The latest break in the case against Cali came from a joint customs DEA operation called Cornerstone. Put a lot of mid-level Cali guys behind bars in the States. And while they weren't eager to help us, you can always count on some poor relative in Colombia who would do whatever it takes to get their brother or son back home. And if that sounds harsh, it's because it is. DEA doesn't fuck around. In its prime, the Cali cartel was moving 30 tons of coke a month into America. Most of it through their New York operation and an alliance with Mexican traffickers out of Juarez that brought tons of product across our border. That means that in an average 6-month period, they could put 180 tons on the street. But there was nothing average about this. These were the last 6 months in the life of the Cali cartel. They were going for it, making sure there were no loose ends. While they were building up their retirement accounts, what were we doing about it? Jack shit. Money makes the world go round. Legal or illegal, good guys and bad guys, we all chase money. For the DEA, it's about budget meetings and kissing the right ass to keep the funding flowing. But if you're a trafficker, getting the money is easy. It's holding on to it that's hard. In the early days, cash was flown back to Colombia on the same planes that carried coke into the States. Then it was converted into pesos, or, if you were Pablo Escobar, stuck in a hole somewhere. One trafficker died with so much cash buried on his property. When it rained, the river downstream became clogged with bills that had washed free. The biggest problem with illegal money is the trail that it leaves. Once upon a time, American banks would take your money, no questions asked. That changed when President Nixon signed the Bank Secrecy Act, requiring all U.S. banks to report transactions involving more than $10,000 in cash. And from that law, money laundering was born. The first stage of money laundering is called placement, and Cali had it down to an art, bringing workers from the comunas to the U.S., where their job was to buy money orders, each just under 10 grand, so they wouldn't be reported. No ID was required, and the orders could even remain blank until they were deposited or cashed. Once they'd bought a bunch of money orders, they packed them up and sent them south, to a land of sunshine and lax oversight. Switzerland on the Caribbean. Panama. Since they didn't regulate wire transfers, Panama was the perfect place for the second stage of money laundering, layering. And here's where the master goes to work. The behind-the-scenes MVP of any drug cartel is the money launderer, the guy that takes the dirty money and scrubs it clean. Here's how. The money orders were deposited into local bank accounts and then bounced through shell companies and limited partnerships, creating an untraceable web of phony purchase orders and transaction reports, wiping clean the money's criminal origins. But no matter how well you hide it, money always leaves a trail, and the best way to hurt the Cali cartel was to find it. While the terms of surrender were being finalized, the brothers had gone underground to avoid capture. They abandoned their swank estates, secretly moving to new homes where they could continue running their empire without setting foot in one of their legitimate businesses. And all this while Chepe continued to expand their New York operation. But sometimes, even the best get unlucky. A computer glitch in Monaco led authorities to notice that one limited partnership had multiple accounts at the same bank. When they looked closer, they found it had ties to hundreds of bullshit accounts across Europe. And they all led back to one bank, right here in Bogota. Lucky for us, the president had given the DEA our best weapon yet, the Clinton list. If we suspected a company of working with traffickers, their name went on the list. And then they were banned from doing business with U.S. companies, and U.S. companies were banned from doing business with them. You get fucked both ways. And you wanna know what the best part is? We don't even have to prove it. We just put you on the list, and the OFAC takes care of the rest. Armed with the threat of the Clinton list, we could get pretty much any information we wanted. And that's how we were able to give Cali's #1 money launderer a name. Franklin Jurado. Because it was illegal for Colombian citizens to have U.S. currency in their possession, a money launderer became more than just a connection to the financial institutions that wash their cash. For all intents and purposes, he is their money. Jurado was the perfect bridge between the Narcos and the world of high finance. He spoke 5 languages and traveled on multiple passports. He married an American girl he met while at business school in the States. Took her down south and got her in on his action. That American passport was solid gold in any Caribbean bank. Jurado was smooth. But now, we knew his name. Amado Carrillo Fuentes, leader of the Juarez cartel. He was one of the most enterprising traffickers in Mexico and one of the first to get into business with his Colombian friends to the south. While Escobar saw the Mexican traffickers as a threat, Cali saw them as a partner. A partner that shared over 1,900 miles of virtually undefended border with Cali's biggest customer, the United States. And right about the time the Caribbean corridor closed, along came NAFTA, and the U.S.-Mexico border was open for business. And Amado took full advantage, agreeing to ferry Cali cocaine into the States. They called it the Mexican trampoline, bouncing cocaine into America and bouncing cash right back. I don't give Gilberto Rodriguez credit for much, but I have to hand it to him. He was a man in control. He was married to 3 women at the same time. And he managed them the same way he ran his business, scheduled down to the minute. Wife number 3 got him Monday and Tuesday. Number 2 got him Wednesday and Thursday. And wife number 1 got him Friday and Saturday. Sundays were for football. All the wives were invited if they wanted to come. They usually did, and they all got along. That was the deal, and he made it work. He insisted on it. He made far more friends than enemies, and he would count on those friends to protect him. His retirement was going to go his way too. He wasn't going to die on some shitty rooftop. Nobody was stabbing him in the back. Nobody forcing him out. Like I said, he was a man in control. A guy who never made a wrong move in his life. A guy who built a billion-dollar empire brick by brick. A guy who owned every cop in town. A guy with a get-out-of-jail-free card burning a hole in his pocket. And you want to go after him? Shit. You'd have to be crazy, stupid, brave, and lucky all at the same time. For those of us who thought the surrender was bullshit, Gilberto's arrest proved that these guys could be caught. For the people who thought the surrender was the only way to avoid violence, it was the beginning of a nightmare. The first shot in a war to bring down another cartel. But whatever side you fell on, one thing was clear. Gilberto Rodriguez's arrest came as a surprise to everybody. Especially him. Colombia had recently elected a new president, a man named Ernesto Samper. Escobar's hitters had tried to assassinate him in an earlier election, so he was no friend of the Narcos. And while he knew his country was tired of violence, he and his new staff, including Defense Minister Fernando Botero, were already in a tough spot. Politically, the surrender deal was ugly, but they were willing to live with it. Gilberto's arrest made that harder than planned, and they weren't shy about saying it. The Cali cartel is an almost perfect organism. Even though we had cut off its head, the body kept right on going, making and selling cocaine. They stuck to the plan, and for a long time, that plan had worked for them. But no plan is perfect, especially when you deal with a substance as volatile as cocaine. At some point, you're gonna make a mistake, and your enemies, who are watching and waiting, they're gonna see your weakness and make a move. See, that's the thing about plans. No matter how perfect you think they are, however brilliant or audacious they may be, well, they can still go to shit when that one thing goes wrong. And once that happens, there's no going back. It's all downhill from there. So here's what you need to know about Curaçao. It's a smuggler's paradise. And for the Cali cartel, you can't beat the location. Only 40 miles separates South American coast from Curaçaoan ports, prized for centuries by smugglers, slave traders, and now cartels. Cruise ships filled with old people next to speedboats filled with cash. And what doesn't get smuggled through, it ends up in banks. Hundreds of them. Way back, some enterprising Dutchmen set up a financial system cloaked in old-world secrecy. Their economy is so dependent on money launderers parking their cash that you can make an arrest, just not at or near a bank. Of course, where do you think Franklin spent most of his time? Now, why would a Cali godfather come out of hiding and risk getting captured? Because what good is being the king if nobody knows it? The biggest thing to come out of Cali wasn't cocaine. It was salsa. And every year, the two combined at the annual Feria de Cali, a week-long extravaganza of parties and salsa concerts. And the man who always presided over the opening night festivities? Gilberto Rodriguez. But with him in jail, it was time for a new king. Things don't always go according to plan. You can use every hope and prayer you have, take your shot, and everything still goes to shit. And when that happens, it's almost like you never had a plan at all. That's when people get desperate, and things get dangerous. War had returned to Colombia. Cocaine cartels are about succession. The number 2 guys realize that the number 1 guys are on their way out, so they decide to speed things up. With Gilberto Rodriguez in jail, there was blood in the water, and blood begets more blood. I told you that Cali ran their empire like a business. Well, when your business gets too big, you start selling franchises. Cali basically allowed traffickers who would normally be their rivals to work under the umbrella of their political protection, to use their cocaine distribution network, and to take advantage of their muscle when shit got heavy. In return, they demanded loyalty and a hefty cut of the profits. And for a long time, that was cool. But, as brilliant as Cali's surrender plan was, it didn't take into account that nobody wants to retire in second place. North Valley Cartel was ready for first place. Traffickers like Ivan Urbinola, Henry Loaiza, Gerda Salazar, and the North Valley boss, Orlando Henao. They didn't need to retire. They controlled not only the rural North Valley, but the port of Buenaventura, from which most of the world's cocaine shipped. It was the jewel in their crown. And they did business differently than Cali. Let's just say they didn't give a shit about public relations. Fuck the gentlemen of Cali, they figured. With the port and Cali's current legal troubles, They had a shot at taking over. It is often said in organized crime, through intimidation and corruption, the Cali cartel had effectively taken much of the Colombian National Police Force and bent them to its will. But there was one force it couldn't bend. A man named General José Serrano, whose faith and integrity were exactly what we needed. Serrano took two things seriously: his service to God and his belief in the rule of law. He expected the same from his men. For him, it began at an early age. He was a campesino, the son of a dirt farmer. He had never owned a pair of shoes. One day, a group of mounted policemen rode into his village. It reminded him of the holy knights that he had read about, religious warriors on a mission from God. He knew then that he would be one of them. He joined the force, expecting to find other like-minded men, but instead he found corruption. And where he could, he rooted it out. When he became chief of his first small town, he fired over 2/3 of the department for being on the take, declaring war on corrupt cops and traffickers alike. 20 years and numerous failed assassination attempts later, he was still waging his war. By the book, of course. The same is true of your enemies. They will unite when they need to. FARC, or Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, were a guerrilla army about 17,000 strong, engaged in the longest civil war in modern history. And in the early days of that war, how did they finance their struggle? Kidnapping. Wealthy Colombians would pay a ransom to have their loved ones returned unharmed. So when the Cali cartel wanted to keep someone on ice, safely hidden somewhere in the middle of the jungle, they hired the pros. For a hefty fee, of course. Private militias not only weren't illegal in Colombia, they were encouraged. A government program called Convivir was started in 1994, and it authorized private security forces to take up arms against the communist guerrillas. A free pass for crimes against humanity, sponsored by Uncle Sam. The Castaños ran the largest private militia in Colombia. Their AUC, or Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, numbered in the tens of thousands. Their victims in the hundreds of thousands. Theirs was a perpetual war, and if you're hunting communist guerrillas in a jungle, they were your only call. In law enforcement, your only real power comes from the strength of the system that you represent. You gotta believe it has your back. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's so compromised, so corrupt, that you can't trust it. What do you do then, when it tries to play you? You look for a way to play it right back. The Colombian government was quick to claim victory. The arrest of Miguel Rodriguez and the surrenders of Pacho Herrera and Chepe Santa Cruz looked like big wins in the war on drugs. But they were bullshit. The only real victory belonged to the godfathers of Cali, safely ensconced in a Bogota jail, still billionaires, submitting to a justice that they had bought and paid for. They didn't need to build their own prison. The minimum security wing of La Picota would do just fine. They wouldn't be there long. Guillermo Palomari had a lot to say, and he said it in federal courtrooms from Miami to New York City, and people were interested in what he had to say, especially about the cartel's influence with the Colombian government. So that government went on the defensive, but the damage was done. The U.S. House and Senate began making noise about decertification, turning Colombia from an ally in the war on drugs into an enemy, threatening to choke off the vital foreign aid that served the shadowy interests of both nations. And that scared people, enough to see justice finally done. Well, governments don't work that way. A compromise. A charade. A way for governments who don't give a shit about the war they're supposed to be fighting to go on pretending they're winning it. But it can't be won. It'll never be won. At least not until people see it for what it is. Not until they know the truth. And so the truth got out. The news that the Cali cartel had donated to the president's campaign in exchange for virtual immunity turned Colombia upside down. And when the highest-ranking DEA agent in the country went on the record and said not only did the United States know about it, but we allowed it to happen, they couldn't hide from it anymore. The Colombians called the scandal Proceso 8000. And it set into motion a series of events that finally brought the reign of the Cali Godfathers to an end. Chepe Santa Cruz never did make it back to New York. Without the government's guarantee that their sentences would be minimal, Chepe decided that prison wasn't the best place for him to be. And so, he released himself and set out in search of new alliances with partners who could help him rebuild the empire. You won't believe who he chose. It seems the Castaños expected a larger contribution to their cause than Chepe was comfortable making, so the alliance died quickly, and Chepe Santa Cruz's wild ride came to an end. Pacho Herrera didn't fare much better staying in jail. Vendettas in the drug game never end. And Pacho's war on the Salazars made him some lifelong North Valley enemies. And as for the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers, political pressure from the U.S. and a disgraced Colombian president who needed to prove he was tough on Narcos brought back the only effective weapon we have in the war on drugs: extradition. All out of favors and unlikely to find more, they will spend the rest of their lives in a U.S. prison. The good guys didn't do much better. Back in Colombia, Jorge Salcedo was publicly branded a rat. And in the States, despite testimony that he was instrumental to our efforts to capture and prosecute the Cali Godfathers, he still had to plead guilty to felony conspiracy charges. And from there, Jorge Salcedo, the guy who had the most to do with bringing down the Cali cartel, disappeared into the Federal Witness Protection Program somewhere in the U.S. A prison of its own.